discussion. I've been thinking a lot about this. I think we're going to talk about William Blackstone and his ideas on the nature of law. Now, this is something that in my class that I teach at church, as well as in a lot of my discussions with people, when we talk about the founding fathers and the motives behind the founding fathers, I think there's sometimes a lot of confusion. There's a lot of debate, especially now with a lot of the left-leaning education in this country. The left-leaning education seeks to remove a lot of the nature of the philosophy behind the revolution, I think. You really see a lot of leaning upon the idea of the separation of church and state. And we can get into the idea of the separation of church and state a little later on when we discuss that letter in itself. That phrase, the separation of church and state, comes from a letter written in response to the Danbury Baptist Convention in, I think it was Massachusetts or Connecticut, I can't remember which one, but in that state, they actually had a state denomination. So while the federal government couldn't require denomination, in those days, the state governments could have their own state denomination, that you couldn't serve in government unless you were a member of that Christian denomination. So for, like I said, I can't remember if it's Massachusetts or Connecticut, but their state denomination was the Congregationalist Church. So the Danbury Baptists were concerned that the federal government would essentially at some point require a national denomination. Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, in his response to them, stated that the amendments, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution sets a wall between church and state, a wall of separation between church and state. But it gets taken wildly out of context. The point of that letter was not to discourage the influence of the church in government, but rather it's more so to discourage the influence of government within the church. Again, the founding fathers came from previous generations that came here from England. They saw a lot of the corruption that the Church of England had experienced because the head of the Church of England is the King of England. And they believed that, as Martin Luther did with Protestantism and opening the Bible to all people, same with all the different languages that the Bible gets printed in, that it should be up to an individual person to be able to read the Bible and come to right and proper understanding of it. I also think, and we could talk about this in depth in a later episode, I don't think they would have necessarily encouraged the spread of Islam, Hinduism, or atheism for that matter. The latter two just are examples of other religions that I don't think the founders would have been in support of, or the former two, I should say. And then the latter, I think they would have seen as pure foolishness, most of them. One of the things that we discuss in my class quite a lot is that while the founding fathers were not all hard evangelical Christians, as sometimes is said today, which is also incorrect, many of them, even if they were deists, recognized the importance of the Bible, recognized the Bible as perhaps the best iteration of religious dialogue that's ever been given. And so they realized that it would be beneficial for the running of the nation to have the Bible as that center point. Now we can get into others who were Christians. George Washington, I know there's a lot of debate about this. From everything I've read from George Washington, I believe George Washington was a Christian. From everything that I've heard, Sam Adams was a Christian. John Adams, of course, was a Christian. Many of these men, even if they were deists, and even then, I don't think as many of them were deists as they were theological rationalists, which that's an entire conversation in itself. But as we come to this discussion of the Declaration of Independence, as we think about this idea of why our nation exists, I'm going to read to you here from the Declaration of Independence. So you've all heard this phrase, but this is the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, written in 1776, of course, by Thomas Jefferson with the help of Benjamin Franklin and others within the Continental Congress. He wrote, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." So that very first sentence, we have this statement: the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Now, you will hear certain people today make either arguments, statements, phrases that the laws of nature is invoking science, that it is not a theological argument. To be quite honest, I don't know how you can read that entire document and come to that conclusion. I don't know how you can read a number of the documents of the of that founding era of the Declaration and a lot of the literature surrounding that time and come to that conclusion. But I want to take you back a little bit further from the Revolution. This idea of the laws of nature and nature's God. What does that mean? It originally comes from Sir William Blackstone. Now, some of you, I'm sure, will know who William Blackstone is. If you're a historian and if you're a fan of this time period, I'm sure that you have come across William Blackstone in your reading. William Blackstone wrote, he was a jurist. He was a lawyer and a jurist. And when he gets a little bit later in life, he writes a book called the Commentaries on the Laws of England. This book sort of takes off like wildfire to an extent. It becomes extremely popular. It's actually a set of books. Blackstone actually becomes most famous for this book, not as much his time as a judge or his time in politics. It's this book. We know that after its publication in the 1760s, late 1760s, it was written between 1765 and 1769. We know that after it was published, it pretty much became the basis of law for the both England as well as throughout the colonies. If you were going to pursue a legal education in the colonies of the Empire of Britain, you more than likely would have been required to read this book. We also know that for many of the students that went into law school at this time, there were a number of them that went into law school as skeptics or atheists or deists, these types of things. But then they come out as Christians, and they come out as Christians largely in part because of this book. And most specifically, part of the introductory section of the book, section 2, titled Of the Nature of Laws in General. So bear with me here. We're going to go through a couple different points. He writes, "Law in its most general and comprehensive sense signifies a rule of action, and is applied indiscriminately to all kinds of action, whether animate or inanimate, rational or irrational. Thus we say the laws of motion, of gravitation, of optics or mechanics, as well as the laws of nature and of nations. It is that rule of action which is prescribed by some superior and which the inferior is bound to obey." So we're already stating in this idea, so what is law? Why do we have law? What's the importance of law? Why do we need law? And he already starts it off with saying that law must come from a higher source. And he goes right into it here. He says, "Thus when the Supreme Being," that's God, "formed the universe and created matter out of nothing, he impressed certain principles upon that matter, from which it can never depart, and without which it would cease to be. When he put that matter into motion, he established certain laws of motion to which all movable bodies must conform. And to descend from the greatest operation to the smallest, when a workman forms a clock or other piece of mechanism, he establishes at his own pleasure certain arbitrary laws for its direction, as that the hand shall describe a given space in a given time, to which law as long as the work conforms, so long it continues in perfection and answers the end of its formation. So he's painting this image. I know some of the younger audience probably doesn't know how to read an analog clock, sees them on the wall, but there's a whole gear mechanism inside of that machine. And the maker of that machine designs every piece, every part. He hand fits it all, makes it work perfectly, and all of those little pieces must obey what he has designed them to do to make it work correctly. To give maybe another example, one of our crew here at Man in the Arena podcast, she is a software person. She is a software engineer. She knows how to do all that. When she writes code, once she sets that code in motion, it must do what she has programmed it to do. It has to follow the law of what she put in there, or else it's not going to work. And also comes back to that same old idea of, with computers, garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage in, it's going to spit garbage back out. So you have to make sure that you put in things that are going to make sense, that everything works together just the same way that that old analog clock from 250 years ago has to obey the laws that its maker put on it to continue to work properly. And so William Blackstone continues. He says, if we further advance from mere inactive matter to vegetable and animal life, we shall find them still governed by laws, more numerous indeed, but equally fixed and invariable. The whole progress of plants, from the seed to the root, and from thence to the seed again, the method of animal nutrition, digestion, secretion, and all other branches of vital economy, are not left to chance or the will of the creature itself, but are performed in a wondrous and voluntary manner, and guided by unerring rules laid down by the great Creator. And this is just a wonderful example. I mean, he makes a great point. When you think about how your body functions, everything must perform flawlessly for it to work. I remember when I was at university, I took a number of psychology courses. One of the courses I found most interesting was sensation and perception. And we went through, for example, the human eye and everything that is required for you to be able to see. The light has to come into your eye. It bounces off and activates the rods and cones within the eye, which send different chemical messages to the brain, which allow you to interpret that light as sight in your brain. And it all happens in millionths of a second. I mean, that's how fast everything occurs with our processing. And it works. Every day you wake up, it works. Every day you go to sleep, it works. It just is constantly working. God set that law in motion, and it will continue to work unless something else is done to it. And we talk about death and war, and that leads into a whole different theological conversation of why do we die and why do things fall apart. And the point is that even though we are in a fallen world, we are still in a world that has to obey the laws that God has designed it to obey for it to function. This, then, is the general signification of law, a rule of action directed by some superior being, and in those creatures that have neither the power to think nor to will, such laws must be invariably obeyed, so long as the creature itself subsists, for existence depends on that obedience. But laws in their more confined sense, and in which it is our present business to consider them, denote the rules, not of action in general, but of human action or conduct. That is, the precepts by which man, the noblest of all sublunary beings, a creature endowed with both reason and free will, is commanded to make use of those faculties in the general regulation of his behavior. So what Blackstone is saying is that when we start talking about law in respect to humans, we are the only class of creature on this planet that has free will and thought. I know that's going to probably offend some people. I'm sorry. Your dog doesn't think. Your dog may have a personality. My cat, I love my cat. My cat has her own personality, but my cat does not pontificate on the nature of life and death. My cat does not pontificate on the nature of right and wrong. My cat licks her own butt in front of me and it doesn't bother her at all. They don't have a sense of those higher orders that we do. We have been blessed by that from God, or with that from God. And so then it's up to us to use our faculties to maintain behavior that's in subordination to God's will. So he continues here. He said, man considered as a creature must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he is entirely a dependent being. A being independent of any other has no rule to pursue, but such as he prescribes to himself. But a state of dependence will inevitably oblige the inferior to take the will of him on whom he depends as the rule of his conduct. So if we existed in a vacuum and there was no God, there was no higher being, we could act within our own true accordance and do whatever we want to do, act within what you might term as chaos. But there is a higher power, and that higher power created us, so therefore we are obedient to the laws that higher power has laid down. This principle, therefore, has more or less extent and effect in proportion as the superiority of the one and the dependence of the other is greater or less, absolute or limited. And consequently, as man depends absolutely upon his Maker for everything, it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his Maker's will. So this is starting to come into some biblical concepts of the idea that, every breath we take as a gift from God. Every morsel of food we consume because God has allowed us to have the ability to procure, cook, and consume that food. Every drink of water we take because God has allowed us to have access to that water. There's nothing that we take or partake in to continue our existence that we have done strictly out of our own force of will, like you might sort of start to hear from the materialistic side of the aisle when we get into atheism and determinism and communism and nihilism and going into all of those sort of left-wing philosophies. So, when we talk about the Maker's will, this is where we're going to get into what we really are seeing in the Declaration of Independence. William Blackstone writes, this will of his Maker, of man's Maker, is called the law of nature. For as God, when he created matter and endued it with a principle of mobility, established certain rules for the perpetual direction of that motion. So when he created man and endued him with free will to conduct himself in all parts of life, he laid down certain immutable laws of human nature, whereby that free will is in some degree regulated and restrained, and gave him also the faculty of reason to discover the purport to those laws. So not only has God laid down this law, the law has been put into motion, it is the law of nature, and we, man, have been given the ability to discover those laws and define them. It's one of the things I find so interesting when I watch a lot of, because I really like a lot of these science shows, like about the universe and the ocean and all these things. And I always find it amazing when I listen to a person like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye or a couple of these other well-known names. And when they speak of the laws of physics, when they speak of these different things, they speak almost as if man had invented them. Man has not invented anything in that sense. We have discovered that those laws exist. We've discovered the values of those laws, but even then, those laws existed far before man was ever able to understand them, before man had the technology, the theories, and everything that made it possible to understand how the natural world works in that sense. And the only reason these men are able to understand these things because God made their brain and gave them the gift to understand these concepts, these laws. And he continues, he says, considering the Creator only as a being of infinite power, he was able unquestionably to have prescribed whatever laws he pleased to his creature, man, however unjust or severe. But as he is also a being of infinite wisdom, he has laid down only such laws as were founded in those relations of justice that existed in the nature of things antecedent to any positive precept. These are the eternal, immutable laws of good and evil, to which the Creator himself and all his dispensations conforms, and which he has enabled human reason to discover. So I want to stop right there, because that is a statement about God, that God is completely holy, God is completely just, and the laws that God has required for man to obey are also completely just and completely holy. And he has allowed us to have reason to be able to discover these things, so far as they are necessary for the conduct of our actions. Such, among others, are these principles: that we should live honestly, should hurt nobody, and should render to everyone his due, to which these three general precepts Justinian has reduced the whole doctrine of law. And he goes on, I'm not going to read this whole section to you because this is probably 10 sentences, but he goes on to talk about eternal justice. And that, for example, that God has so intimately connected, so inseparably interwoven the laws of eternal justice with the happiness of each individual, that the latter cannot be obtained but by observing the former. And if the former be punctually obeyed, it cannot but induce the latter. So we talk about happiness. We look at our culture today, Western culture specifically, and Western culture is so concerned with the happiness of man, with the, I want to be entertained, I want to live entertained, I want to be entertained, I want to live happily. Happiness is not merely being entertained. Happiness is being in concordance with the laws of God. If you look at somebody who lives their life contrary to the law which God has designed, their life ultimately will turn into a train wreck. It's just as simple as that. Whether it's sexual promiscuity, whether it's the use of drugs, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's theft, murder, any of these breakings of the law of God will ultimately lead you to a life of pain. Now, it's not to say, I'm not some prosperity gospel preacher here trying to tell you that if you just obey God, he'll make you rich and healthy, but that as you go through life, if you obey the laws of God, A, you're going to have a clear conscience, the most you can obey them. And then on top of that, you will, as you go through the difficult things, have the ability to make your way through them. You have a solid foundation to work through. You're not bringing on any unnecessary attention from law enforcement. You're not bringing on the diseases that are associated with alcoholism, drug use, sexual promiscuity. You're free of these types of things. It allows you to live your life easier. These laws exist in connection with our happiness. And then we get to what I think is perhaps the most important part of this as it relates to the American Revolution. He writes, this law of nature, being coeval with mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe in all countries and at all times. And watch this now. He writes, no human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. And such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority, mediately or immediately, from this original. So we talk about, for example, if we look at the Bible in Romans 13, that God has instituted government. God has throughout the centuries, the eons, the millennia, instituted governments, and that governments ultimately derive their authority from God. Now, we do talk about the will of the people and all these other types of things, but in this specific sense, the American Revolution would not have succeeded if God had not wanted it to succeed. It would have been crushed, and the American patriots that we talk about today would be labeled as rebels and traitors to the crown, and that would be about what it amounts to. Think of the American Civil War. How do we talk about the Confederates that lost, for example? So, in this sense, God has laid down these laws, and government is supposed to, as Paul writes in Romans 13, punish wicked behavior and reward good behavior. Punish behavior that goes against the law of God, reward behavior that goes in line with the law of God. There's only two professions in the entire Bible that are referred to as the ministers of God. Preachers, prophets, those types are ministers of God. And then in Romans 13, Paul talks about the government is the right hand of God. It is God's minister of wrath on this planet. And this is something that even Blackstone realized, if the government then goes against what it has been ordered by God to do, now that government is not of any validity. That law that it has written is not of any validity. We talk about, there's this cry in our nation now to legalize abortion and protect abortion up to and including the birth of the full-grown child. I'm telling you right now, that is a violent violation of the law of God. You are murdering innocent human beings for some temporary reason. That is not within the law of God. That goes blatantly against the law of God. So therefore, that law has no actual validity. They will enforce it, and they will do everything they can to enforce it. But in the eyes of overarching history, in the eyes of God, that law no longer is a valid law. And we can go into in another discussion how then judgment is brought upon any people or any government who's going to pursue something like that. And then he continues on. This has given manifold occasion for the benign interposition of divine providence, which, in compassion to the frailty, the imperfection, and the blindness of human reason, has been pleased at sundry times and in diverse matters to discover and enforce its laws by an immediate and direct revelation. So he's basically saying, while these laws exist and while God has put these laws into motion, man is not simply born with just all of the knowledge, right? Man has to discover the knowledge for himself. And God, being a God of mercy and of having this benevolent view of man, his creature, has in these different times and in these different places delivered to man these laws from himself. Well, how, EJ, did he do this, you may ask? Well, Blackstone continues, the doctrines thus deliver we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found, watch this very closely, only in the Holy Scriptures. Period. He says it right there. There is, at least in this idea of Western law, the origin of Western law, there is only one ultimate source of the law of God, or one ultimate place you can go to find the law of God, and that is the Holy Bible. Period. There's no other source of law in that sense. He continues, these precepts, when revealed, are found upon comparison to be really a part of the original law of nature, as they tend in all their consequences to man's felicity. Oh, the Bible goes hand in hand with the laws of nature, he just says. And they go hand in hand for the consequence to man's happiness. And he goes, but we are not from thence to conclude that the knowledge of these truths was attainable by reason in its present corrupted state, because man is a corrupted creature. That's the other part of this whole thing. We also have law because man is by his nature evil. God is by his nature good, and God has, through his mercy, come down and given these things to us. Since we find that until they were revealed, they were hid from the wisdom of the ages. Think of all of the philosophers of ancient Greece, all of the philosophers of Rome, the seers and astrologers of Persia and Babylon, all of the knowledge that these men accumulated. We still use the Greek philosophers today in our reasoning and in our debate. But these men were not Christians. These men had not experienced the revelation of God's law. All of the rest of the wisdom of the ages, the law of God was hid from except in these books. As then the moral precepts of this law are indeed of the same original with those of the law of nature, so their intrinsic obligation is of equal strength and perpetuity. So the moral precepts of the law of God from the Bible are as important as the laws of nature that God has also set in motion. And they have the same strength and the same perpetuity. They're just as eternal as the Bible is just as eternal as the law of gravity and all of these different types of things. Yet undoubtedly the revealed law is of infinitely more authenticity than that moral system which is framed by ethical writers and denominated in the natural law, because one is the law of nature, expressly declared so by God himself. The other is only what, by the assistance of human reason, we imagine to be that law. So we look at all these philosophers, we look at laws also that are written in government. They don't have the authority that the Bible and the laws of nature do, because those come originally from God. If we could be as certain of the latter as we are of the former, both would have equal authority, but till then, they cannot be put in competition with each other. So, I'm not going to continue on going through this. If you ever have the opportunity to get this book, continue to read it. There are so many wonderful truths, but I think you can start to see why so many people went to law school in Great Britain and in the colonies, and they came to the realization that there is a God. He goes through this whole exposition on God and what God is doing and the laws that God has revealed to us, and that government has to be in submission to those laws. And so we see this reflected in the Founding Fathers. We have here The Rights of Colonists as Men by Samuel Adams, written in 1772. And this is something that, Sam Adams is referred to by King George III as the chief rabble-rouser of the colonies. And he states, all positive and civil laws should conform as far as possible to the law of natural reason and equity. As neither reason requires nor religion permits the contrary, every man living in or out of a state of civil society has a right peaceably and quietly to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty, and matters spiritual and temporal is a thing that all men are clearly entitled to by what? The eternal and immutable laws of God and nature, as well as by the laws of nature and all well-grounded and municipal laws, which must have their foundation in the former. So right there, we have this idea that the laws of the rights of the colonists, your rights as a human being, and this is something that, when we get to maybe reading through the Declaration of Independence is discussed so much. Your rights as a human being exist with you because God made you, not because you're a human being. God has endowed you with these rights, and so you are entitled to these rights until you use them to break the law, at which point you forfeit. It's that same idea we see in the Old Testament. He that sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. The punishment for murder is to be killed. And then we have another little statement here. This is from the Congress. It's an address to the inhabitants of America in the middle of the Revolutionary War. And they make this little aside. They say, you cannot but remember how reluctantly we were dragged into this arduous contest. And this is something we can talk about later too, but how much the colonists, spoke out against what was going on and really tried for about 20 years to ask the king and the parliament to respect their rights and to respect their wishes, until they finally were forced into the use of arms. And how repeatedly, with the earnestness of humble entreaty, we supplicated a redress of our grievances from him who ought to have been the father of his people. It's the king. Again, they're referencing that the king is under this obligation from the law of God to reward right and punish wrong. In vain did we implore his protection, in vain appeal to the justice, the generosity of Englishmen, of men who had been the guardians, the assertors, and vindicators of liberty through a succession of ages, men who with their swords had established the firm barrier of freedom and cemented it with the blood of heroes. I just love that poetic language. They continue, every effort was vain, for even whilst we were prostrated at the foot of the throne, the fatal blow was struck which has separated us forever. Again, they're putting this on the king. We have come to you because we are trying to live in right accordance with God and right accordance with you and the way that God has ordained for government to be run. Thus spurned, contemned, and insulted, thus driven by our enemies into measures which our souls abhorred, we made a solemn appeal to the tribunal of unerring wisdom and justice, to that almighty ruler of princes, whose kingdom is over all. So ultimately, they still, midway through the war, we mix to an extent the political cause ultimately goes, we are going to God directly because the only way we can be successful with this is to go to God. We have tried peacefully to resolve this. We've tried for years and years to resolve this peacefully, and every time we were kicked away from the throne. So now we must go. Basically, we are appealing to that higher law. We are appealing to what Blackstone is talking about, the superior law, the law of God. Because if we are disobedient to the law of God, then we are accursed. So, and I know that there's people that will disagree with this. I'm very aware there's people who disagree with this. One of my favorite preachers, John MacArthur, is very against what the Founding Fathers did. He stated that in several sermons. He believes they were acting against God by their rebellion to the king. I think there might be validity to that. From my study, I still think what they did was the right thing, and I ultimately come back to, I think if God didn't want them to do that, he would not have allowed them to have been successful. They would have been failures, and each one of the Founding Fathers would have died a traitor's death. They would have been drawn and quartered. They would have been disemboweled. They would have been dismembered and beheaded, and their body parts sent to different parts of the empire as an example. So, in closing, I hope you enjoy this little discussion on the nature of law as it's been laid down by William Blackstone, its influence upon the Founding Fathers. It's actually pretty profound influence within the Declaration of Independence. And we will see you next time. Please like, comment, and subscribe on this video, and follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you. Bye.